Hello everyone and welcome to this NBS webinar, Sustainable Specification Outcomes, part of our current series on sustainability. Some quick housekeeping items before we begin. For the smooth running of the webinar and to avoid feedback and other sound issues, your microphones will be muted. You can still ask questions during the webinar by using the questions box within the platform, which should be on the right hand side of your screens. All your questions will be captured and answered as part of the follow-up after the webinar ends. There are a number of current NBS customers registered today and some who will be new to NBS, so remember you can always get in touch with us if you do have additional queries. My name is Paul and you may know me from previous webinars or presentations. I'm Head of Technical Solutions at NBS, working with customers to help them implement our platforms successfully and use NBS content. I'm glad to be joined today by Richard Sabin, MD of Biotecture, producers of fantastic vertical planting solutions. Richard is a passionate and informed sustainability and landscape educator, and I've really enjoyed his recent presentations. Today's session is divided between me and Richard. I'll begin by providing some context around sustainable outcomes and targets in relation to the built environment. And in these vast subject areas, it's useful to focus down on practical examples, which is why it's great Richard will provide his knowledge on green infrastructure and vertical planting. Richard will present his insights on the future of greening, the impact of investing in green infrastructure, the benefits and positive outcomes with a focus on biomembranes, what planting can do for air quality and biodiversity. We'll also look at some case studies and some real-world solutions in terms of their technical design. Then there's time for a discussion where I'll ask some questions about maintenance and planting and the practicalities of what he has demonstrated. Finally, we'll briefly look at NBS Chorus and NBS Source for some examples of how the platform can help you find sustainability guidance and environmental properties for your specification choices. This NBS webinar is part of a 4-webinar series on sustainability topics in the run-up to COP26, the Conference of the Parties, this international UN summit on climate change, which is being held in Glasgow at the start of November. Last week, Lee Jones, my colleague, looked at becoming a sustainable business and some of the NBS initiatives that move us in the right direction. Next week is a marketing masterclass on honest and transparent promotion of sustainability credentials, avoiding greenwashing. And then on the 26th, I'm back with Claire Galland from Everflow to talk about sustainable water use, flood mitigation, and living with the changing water cycle. So do register for the next 2 webinars as well. As Lee mentioned in the last webinar, NBS is now part of the Big Factor Group, and along with our sister company Glenigan, at group level there are now a number of sustainability initiatives taking place. We're working with Forest Carbon in terms of offsetting our 2019 and 2020 emissions, and that will total 3,220 trees in Durham and Northumberland. We've also signed the UN Climate Neutral Now pledge, requiring us to report our operational carbon annually, commit to reducing our emissions, and aim to become a net zero business. So let's set the context as an introductory section to this webinar. It's important to put specification in context of the wider sustainability goals and targets that the industry needs to achieve. The first is that the built environment is responsible for 40% of UK carbon emissions, and that there are some fairly ambitious targets in place ahead of events like COP26, but also those targets for 2030 and 2050. In particular, that versus our 1990 levels, the UK has signed up to reducing 100% the emissions versus those levels. And currently, here, 2019, I think this figure is from, it was a 27% reduction. So still a long way to go, really, in terms of being able to do that. And we're aiming for net zero in those targets, not just carbon neutral, but where we are truly net zero. And those global tipping points of 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees of warming are very likely to be exceeded unless some urgent reductions happen now. And in fact, worldwide emissions have actually risen 60% since 1990. So still a long way to go, and that's why things like COP26 are so important when we're trying to have these discussions. All of these efforts tie back to the overarching UN Sustainable Development Goals. And these gigantic themes like poverty and hunger can sometimes feel detached from construction, but there's many areas where the built environment has real impact, whether that's good health and the way that we design those buildings for healthcare, sustainable cities and communities, responsible consumption, and life on land, where much of our discussion will be focused today. But also things like climate action, which is very much kind of umbrella across so much of this, clean water, and innovation in infrastructure as well. And one of the things in the RIBA Sustainable Outcomes Guide is this diagram showing that mapping across to where buildings and infrastructure have an impact on the UN Sustainable Design Goals. And that's a really great guide, and there's an excellent webinar from back in 2020 with my colleague Michelle and also Gary Clark from HOK, the lead author of that document, summarising the RIBA guide and going into detail on how NBS can be used to specify sustainable outcomes, using those key topic areas to highlight relevant NBS content that picks up on each of those requirements, whether that's at a very high level in terms of some of the information in our prelims content, or down to the real detail of things like net zero operational carbon, embodied energy, sustainable water cycle, connectivity, land use, and so on. Based on feedback and additional information from LETI, the London Energy Transformation Initiative, and the Green Construction Board, the sustainability workstream of the Construction Leadership Council, those RIBA outcome targets were shifted this year, reducing some of the targets to make them more achievable whilst remaining ambitious for most project types. And all of these targets are likely to keep shifting with more information and to refine them by building sector, building type. We're already another year or more closer to 2025 and have limited time to achieve these targets, which as a minimum projects should be adopting for performance outcomes. Anything beyond those is very much unsustainable practice, and in order to achieve targets for 2030, there's still a great deal of work to do, and so those targets in place should be really the minimum that we're trying to achieve. Whatever discipline or sectors you work in, you'll find all the professional institutes are working to the same kind of goals. The RICS Futures Report has a section on how their membership are collaborating on climate goals. CIBSE have updated Guide L on sustainability for building services engineering, and Guide A and the TM guides are commonly used in calculations there. And then there's the phenomenal work going on at ICE with their Shaping Zero project and this State of the Nation report, looking at how civil engineers can act on climate issues. Helpful then, I think, to focus down on one particular area of sustainable specification and look at some case studies that we can learn from. And when I joined NBS a decade ago, one of the first things I was asked to do as a technical author was to develop content for living walls, green walls, or vertical planting systems, as they're called, which probably indicates where the industry was at that point, where that was a fairly young technology, and there were examples of where it was very successful, but also where it was failing too. And since then, they've become really sophisticated. They bring biodiversity, shading and cooling structures, and bringing plants into unused parts of the public realm. So I thought it was a really useful example of how you can specify sustainable outcomes. Which is why I'm delighted that Richard Sabin is here from Biotecture to take us through some of those sustainable outcomes and really look at the positive benefits of vertical planting systems. Over to you, Richard.
Well, thanks, Paul. I'm passionate about the increasingly important role that plants play in our urban landscape. They help to mitigate for some of our negative impacts, such as air pollution and biodiversity loss, but also to enrich our spaces, our mental well-being, and give us an opportunity to reconnect with nature, even in the heart of our cities. The business sector that puts plants in, on, and around buildings is called green infrastructure, and this is where we specialise. So I'm going to speak about just how valuable green infrastructure is, both in the built environment and the part that it can play in our response to what's called the climate emergency. And then I'll talk about some specific vertical green infrastructure with a couple of case studies. But first, a little bit of background about me, about our philosophy at Biotecture, and a quick look at why green infrastructure is so relevant to the challenges we face, particularly today. So I've spent my career in construction. As a civil engineer, I worked on the UK portal of the Channel Tunnel. And over the years, I got more and more distressed by the misuse of natural materials, to the point where I've said to myself, I've got to change everything I'm doing and I need to make it more sustainable. How could we work more in tune with the natural world? And what would it look like to harness the power of plants in our cities? And so we designed and developed a sustainable living range screen cladding system. And our vision is to transform urban environments, and by doing so, to reconnect people with nature. And in the face of all the challenges that we face, we like to take a positive view. Yes, we need to mitigate, but just focusing on reducing negatives is sometimes a really difficult message to impart. And it turns out that moving to a greener economy is enriching in so many ways. And so we also want to focus on those positives when talking about creating the sustainable urban landscapes that we want to see for the future. And it seems that we all now want to reconnect with nature, which is great news. But the sad reality is that we've never actually disconnected from nature. We've just either ignored it or brushed it aside, or otherwise justified not considering nature in our decisions and our impacts on the natural world. And that's all coming home to roost now. So we net hedges and trees out of season so birds can't nest in them. We change natural environments. We pollute. And the results show very clearly that we've never been disconnected from the natural world. The biosphere that surrounds our planet is about 12 miles thick. It's the only place we know where life exists. Our economies, societies, and culture is wholly set inside this zone. And yet we continue to push boundaries that we probably shouldn't be pushing. The mid-century expected increased temperature and climate change impacts will likely become a reality, regardless of the net zero carbon drive that is finally now gaining unstoppable momentum. But we need to go further. A report by the excellent Stockholm Resilience Centre put it like this: the notion that humanity is external to the biosphere has allowed for models in which technological progress is expected to enable humanity to enjoy ever-growing GDP and thus consumption. This view was comparatively harmless as long as the biosphere was sufficiently resilient to supply the demands humanity made of it. This is no longer the case. And this has far-reaching implications for contemporary models of economic possibilities that many still work with and draw conclusions from. So what this means is that we can't just absorb net zero carbon into our business as usual case and then assume everything will be okay. We need a fresh way of thinking. And while there's a single bottom line financially, the metrics for environmental and social sustainability are multifaceted and interconnected and need to be considered in the round. And the danger is the potential environmental tipping points sit across a whole ecological spectrum, from biodiversity species, key species loss to acidification of the oceans, and the whole thing is a house of cards. A focus on one card will have unintended consequences, and that's currently net zero carbon. Yes, it's needed, and finally we have something in sustainability that is measurable in a really distilled way for businesses and authorities. But a holistic approach is the only way if we're to move towards a truly sustainable future. And so we advocate a hierarchical, strong sustainability model that recognises the fact that the economy and society can in no way be seen as being outside or separate from ecology. And we need to stop thinking about doing things for the planet, as if it was an optional extra. To be clear, we need a planet with a viable biosphere, but the planet doesn't really need us. Actually, it'd probably be better off without us. And some of the impacts of us on the planet couldn't be more starker in terms of the demonstration as to when the world was put on pause during the pandemic and nature started to bounce back and dolphins were seen in Venice. And many people in India could see the Himalayas again for the first time in generations. And we also reconnected with nature, both personally during the first lockdown, and now with the drive towards urban regeneration and getting people back into cities, This is being taken back into our urban environments as a driver for encouraging people back into the cities and creating environments that are positive for them and for us. Bringing nature back into the cities isn't new. Think Hanging Gardens of Babylon. We have such an affinity with plants. As an example, just staring at plants is proven to reduce heart rate and blood pressure. Being surrounded by plants is good for us. But there's also so much more with green infrastructure. There's no other building material or sector that offers this multitude of benefits. The ability to tap into all of these benefit streams, or many of these benefit streams, all at the same time. And so this is what makes, for us, green infrastructure fundamental as part of a holistic response to the challenges that we face. Responses that give us benefits across the whole people, planet, and business spectrum. And this infographic from our Cities Alive document really demonstrates where we consider green infrastructure is and what it can do for us. Many people will consider green infrastructure to include coastal areas, uplands, moorlands, big park spaces as well, and that's fine. But the way we view green infrastructure is within the ultra-urban zone, where the green as part of a building block comes under the same constraints and restraints and requirements of any other building material, whether that's spatial constraint or a structural constraint or compliance even. We've identified 4 areas where green infrastructure exists within this ultra-urban zone. Horizontal spaces on structures such as green roofs and podium slabs, pocket parks and linear parks, vertical greening and internal greening. We spend 80 to 90% of our time inside spaces, so we need to have this reconnection with nature inside. And so just to demonstrate an example of the benefits of green infrastructure, you can kind of walk through this one yourself by thinking about, if you wanted to get from the bottom of the slide to the top of the slide, which side of the slide would you prefer to be walking up? Where do you think you might hear birdsong? Where might your conversations be better? Where would the air pollution be lower? And in summer, where might the temperatures be more conducive? And this is what green can do for us, and it also can do the same for the environment around us, and act as a response to what we need to do in terms of our response to the climate emergency. And I'm going to work through 3 different areas where green infrastructure has a valuable part to play before moving on to how we specify green infrastructure. I'm going to talk through building biomembranes, phytoremediation, and biodiversity net gain. And all the time I talk through these examples, it's really important to remember that slide with the holistic benefits and the fact that this isn't single targeting, or while it is single targeting, there's also the other multiple benefits that come into play as well. So building biomembranes. If we think back to the slide that talked about the mid-century temperatures, are we designing our cities and places in ultra-urban zones to accommodate temperature rises like that, to accommodate new climates that may even come into cities that haven't been felt before? Or are we still building with concrete, glass and steel, reflecting temperatures back in and increasing use of air conditioning units? Why not think about building biomembranes, about bringing nature back into the city? With green infrastructure, we can look to deliberately design in filtration systems to filter out sunlight, for example, to allow for the amount of light coming into the building, and particularly the amount of heat coming into the building, to be ameliorated, so that in summer it's slightly warmer, in summer it's slightly cooler, and in winter it's slightly warmer. We can start to think about reducing the amount of air conditioning plant that we need and the amount of air conditioning costs that we have. Studies show that by putting plants on buildings, we can decrease the energy consumption of that building. In winter, heating costs can be reduced by up to 8%. In summer, air conditioning costs can be reduced by over 50%. And if designed properly, air conditioning can be designed out of a building completely. And so with this thermal imaging camera of a project in Southampton Row in Holborn in London, it demonstrates the cooling effect of the plants on the facade of that building in summer. And equally in winter, you would have a slightly warming effect, showing the amelioration effect that the plants would have on the temperature. The second element I want to have a look at is phytoremediation. Now, phytoremediation may be a new term, but it's essentially biological filtration. So phytoremediation is the use of plants to decontaminate spaces, particularly air spaces and watercourses. It's a very underused science. Often when we think about decontamination, we start to look at technology and we start to look at mechanical solutions, whereas biological solutions work very well. If you think on a global scale, plants give us the perfect cocktail of air for us to breathe. Plants can do this at different scales as well. And when we come to the ultra-urban zone, the example that I want to give is around urban street canyons. Now, an urban street canyon is a space where the width between buildings is less than the height of the buildings. And in this space, air becomes endlessly trapped and circulates until something takes it out of that circulation, hopefully not our lungs. And this is where green walls are proven by science theory and in practice to really help to reduce air pollution within these areas. One such project that we worked on is Edgware Road Tube Station in London, completely funded by the Clean Air Fund in 2011. It's a project we designed and installed, and we still maintain it now. Its 10th year anniversary is actually this month. And bearing in mind, again, the multiple benefit streams, the Mayor of London at the time, who's gone on to do another job somewhere or other, has correctly identified the multiple benefit streams that come in here. So whilst, yes, we are reducing air pollution, we are also beautifying the local spot. Our maintenance staff also report the number of bees that are seen on this wall as well. So the multiple benefits really comes into that. And again, if biodiversity becomes our primary requirement in terms of looking forwards, we will still get the multiple benefits of the enrichment of spaces, the air pollution reduction, etc. But there's a lot of science that tells us about the ability of green infrastructure to create networks of green corridors within urban environments. For example, 100 square meters of a blank wall will have about 4 species of spider on it, whereas 100 square meters of living wall will have about 19 species of spider on it. And that change goes up and down kind of the food chain in terms of how we can do that. And we can work with different plant species to improve various measures that we want to. We have a whole suite of plants that are there to encourage biodiversity, a whole different suite of plants that are there to encourage air pollution reduction. And we can include biodiversity habitat boxes as well. These are there to deliberately target and encourage particular species. So we can work with biodiversity action plans to look at what is it that we want to encourage. And a larger example of that would be a vertical forest that we've created at a project in Leeds. Over 150,000 plants and almost 750 habitat boxes encouraging species in there. It's also important with this wall to talk about some of the other interconnected benefits as well, in terms of just the visual enrichment of space within the skyline of Leeds. So moving on, how can we get the best value from specifying green infrastructure? There's 5 things really to consider. I've spoken a little bit about the appropriate plants for the condition that we seek to achieve, whether that's air pollution reduction, biodiversity loss, or enrichment of space. The others are fairly obvious, I suppose, in terms of designing for maintenance, etc., etc. In terms of suitable light levels, we're really talking about indoor situations. Generally, anywhere outdoors, even the heavily shaded situations, have appropriate light levels. But let's get the right plants in to do the right things. But fundamentally, we need to choose a proven system that allows us to do that. There's a number of ways in which we can select the right system for the right location. And there's a few products that I'm just showing here on the slide. And there's also ways of doing this with plants in troughs and containers and growing plants up cables and wires on buildings and ivy screens. I would suggest that you contact us to discuss any more detail about the best way to specify green infrastructure. But I'm just going to highlight a couple of the ways in which we do it. Firstly, a living rain screen cladding system. This was our first system. It's called Biopanel. It's essentially a series of living cladding panels set on a waterproof backing board. there's an intelligent remote controlled irrigation system to allow for that robust maintenance that we were talking about. And whilst on that subject, it is very precise, low volumes of water that we're using. These are quite sophisticated systems, both from an irrigation system point of view and a monitoring point of view. So we're watering precisely at the root zone. So we're reducing any evapotranspiration losses from what we're watering with. So we understand that we're watering much lower than general grounds maintenance in terms of per square meter watering. And the electricity costs for the pump are also very low. So the benefits that come from installing well-designed green walls far outweigh the inputs in terms of water and electricity. Just to run through a very quick case study on this in terms of just showing how this would sit and fit. This is that project in Holborn where you saw on the temperature differential in terms of the amelioration of temperature on the facade. The existing building that the client asked us to look at was an infill between some Edwardian buildings. We put a photo montage on this to see show what it might look like, and it's always quite good to be very visual with what you're going to achieve to show the client what's going to come about. One of the issues with existing building stock, and there will be plenty of existing building stock in 30 years' time when those temperatures go up. So new build is very important, but what we do with existing building stock is also very important. Structural surveys showed that the brick facade would not carry the load of a green wall. So we had to go back to structure. And this is showing the plates going back through to the structure and the galvanized rail system that's there to support the waterproof backing board. Waterproof backing board going on. Then we have the issues with the irrigation. The irrigation is set into zones. You can see the different pipes coming up here. There will be more requirement for irrigation at the top of the wall where the wind is going to act more than at the bottom. Therefore, we need to set it into irrigation zones. So very deliberately, precisely designed for long-term resilience. And then this is showing the irrigation going up onto the wall. And whilst all that's happening, we're going through the third element of the design, which is the planting design. In this project, this is a heavy bus road, heavy use of buses on Southampton Row. We have designed plants for this. We designed plants for this wall that were deliberately there for air pollution reduction reasons. We then grow those plants in our nursery for two reasons. One is to establish good root growth whilst the plants are there, and the second one is to give good visual impression when it first goes on. And then we're also looking at designing around window frames, making sure that around the existing windows we're able to create a really good, robust, finished environment. Our grow medium is for the biopanels called Grodan. It's a fully natural material being spun rock and is the horticultural grade of rock wool, 100% recyclable. We are growing plants in thin engineered situations with minimum inputs and outputs. So for us to use an engineered material makes perfect sense and doesn't deplete soil resources. Grodan's the grow medium of choice for sustainable horticulture. Think any tomato, cucumber, sweet pepper you eat, and it also makes perfect sense for us to be working with it. Yes, and whilst talking about that, it's important that we recognise that whilst we're just putting fuzzy stuff on the outside of buildings, we're also a cladding material, and therefore we need to conform to all the cladding requirements. So this slide is showing the conformance with the CWCT, the Centre for Window and Cladding Technology tests, and also the engineering reaction with regard the engineering assessment with regards to reaction to fire testing. And a couple of examples of the same sort of approach being taken on new builds. This is a car park in Coventry, and superb building biomembrane for a car park. Retail outlets, office spaces. And also to add some interest, this is Foss Park shopping centre in Leicester, where we're trying to encourage people to come back into the spaces, and we're matching up the planting with biodiversity as well. So we're looking at how we can design in habitat boxes into the green spaces and really sort of kill 2, 3, 4, 5 birds with one stone, although killing birds with one stone is absolutely the wrong thing to be saying. The second example I want to give you is PlantBox. PlantBox is a simpler in design, but very effective, particularly in retrofit situations. It's horticulturally endorsed by the RHS, and we work with them to evaluate the best species to use to do whatever it is we want to do. And this is where phytoremediation comes in. Which plant works best to do which thing is that we want to do from a sustainability point of view. We have full specification details on plant box as well. And a quick case study just to show the versatility of this product in terms of vertical greening is in Middlewalk in Woking, where we have some existing balconies that are running off of concrete slabs, but the brick balconies are not structurally able to hold the weight of a green wall. So what we're doing to overcome this is we are forming an angle which is doubling up as the gutter for the green wall into the concrete slab, and then the plant box is just set onto this structural gutter and then purely restrained back at height. So that allows us to really perform some level of urban regeneration without taking up any structural load on the existing building. So to summarize, we face a number of existential challenges, and as placemakers in the built environment, we need to recognize the part we can play in rising to these challenges. Each green infrastructure installation offers multiple benefits in terms of both mitigation and enrichment. And increasingly, this is being recognised in terms of the multiple returns on investment that come from these benefits. And well-designed green infrastructure offers these returns on investment without upsetting the hierarchy of thinking that must be planet, people, business. So in conclusion, while we're focused on the future and all that technology, we cannot escape the fact that we are biological beings who are both deeply connected to and share an affinity with the natural world. By designing with plants, we can tune into the core of who we are as a species and in turn create sustainable urban landscapes that are truly fit for the future. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Richard. Really appreciate that presentation, and so many of the themes that you're talking about are so important to the work that we need to do. We've got some time now for some questions, and I know that there's a few that I'm really keen to ask you. The first, I suppose, is that the focus tends to be on net zero and carbon calculation, but your presentation really indicates the need for a holistic approach, particularly when thinking about greening and biodiversity and the impacts that that can have on the built environment. So how do we shift the conversation away from carbon as being the kind of key target and the key calculation towards a more holistic design approach?
Very good question, Paul. And I don't think actually we should shift it away. I think we need a multiple. We need to have this conversation on a broader bandwidth. I think education is really important. I think some of the education around where some of these sustainability boundaries are that we're currently crossing. Biodiversity is probably the one that frightens scientists the most, even more than climate change, because of the tipping point with particular key indicator species. But we just need to be having a look at all of the sustainability issues as a whole. As I said in the presentation, it really is a house of cards, and this isn't an exact science like mathematics. We don't know what's going to happen if we tug or pull at a particular card. We don't know where the tipping points are. Net zero carbon is very important for particularly the second half of the 21st century. What's going to happen in the first half of the 21st century is kind of already set as we looked at those temperature rises. So adaptation to climate change at this stage, creating biodiversity habitats and some of those networks of green spaces within our cities is actually really important for us to be doing now. And the danger with a single focus on net zero carbon is that we think we've done our job if we achieve it, and we think we're doing our job if we work towards it. Yeah,
exactly that. The other aspect that I wanted to ask you about, I love vertical planting, and I think it does have such a positive effect, whether it's biophilia and that kind of psychological impact, but also seeing biodiversity and nature using and feeding there. So why aren't they everywhere? What are the main barriers to their adoption? Is it funding? Is it awareness? Is it compliance? Is it just a case of educating people on their use? What do you think the barriers are?
Great question again. I think one of the main barriers to green infrastructure deployment is actually inertia. The fact that we haven't done it yet, and it's seen as being new, which is why I give the example of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. When we talk to architects and specifiers and contractors about incorporating plants within their buildings, there is that proverbial sucking through of teeth of, gosh, how's that going to work? How are we going to install that? So I think there's a bit of a misunderstanding around the incorporation of plants within the built environment. And there are three barriers, I think, that really come into it. One is cost, which is the cost of not just implementation, but long-term maintenance as well. And clients being worried about that cost. And our response to that is to shift the whole conversation around cost to value. During the conversation earlier, tried to talk about, the whole value set that green infrastructure gives, and the multiple benefit streams that come from incorporating green. And I think that we tend to narrow in, because it's seen as being new, on the cost of this as a replacement for whatever it was we were going to put in. And actually, whatever it was we were going to put in isn't fit for purpose going forward into the future.
That's really interesting.
And I think that's really important for us to consider. And we want clients to we're starting to see our green infrastructure as an asset rather than a liability. And when you have that mindset shift around turning it around into an asset, suddenly it becomes something different to be seen. It is something that will encourage people back into the urban environment. It will mitigate against all of these environmental credentials. It will help to show off green credentials, which isn't greenwash. It's about actually demonstrating our commitment to the environment, if installed properly. I think compliance is another issue. So moving on from cost into compliance, there are all these, again, this idea of inertia. So you want to put green stuff on plants, on buildings, do you? So we have this sort of folded arms sort of approach of, well, how are you going to do that? And how is it going to conform to X, Y, and Z? Fire is a massive issue at the moment. We mustn't shy away from that. And some of the attitudes towards fire safety on buildings mean that green infrastructure is really struggling to be specified onto buildings. We don't, whilst we understand that buildings need to be fire safe, we believe we've demonstrated that from a green infrastructure point of view. We don't believe that some of the clients' insurers, for example, are taking that as they should do. And we're starting to work a lot with clients who really want to do some good, but don't quite understand where to get the best benefit and the best value. So, we can help through in terms of where can we achieve the best value by installing green infrastructure? Where can we get the best return on investment? Is it a pocket park here? Is it a green wall here? Is it a combination of various other factors? And how can we look at cost and buildability and maintainability going forward? So yes, there are barriers, but we are seeing, particularly post-pandemic, a lot of clients looking to push through those barriers now.
That's interesting. Yeah. And I think when you talk about the kind of understanding of return on investment, so it's not just about the financial impact, but this kind of long-term thinking of what the real planetary impact is going to be, and also at smaller levels, at urban levels, at that kind of domestic level of what the impact's going to be on a project. You mentioned one of the factors there was cost and potentially maintenance cost. How do you begin to calculate or estimate things like maintenance costs or water costs as part of the planning and the specification of something like that?
Yes, I think it's important that we go for this multiple or maximum output compared to minimum input. I think is really important when we look here. So we're looking at being as resource useful as we can with our inputs in terms of minimizing where the water goes to the root zone of the plants, using technology to run that water so we can understand through flow rate and moisture content what the water level is. It's not a hose that we're just spraying across the top and hoping it's going to work. We're very deliberate with that. And it's important that water use is there. Water use on well thought through living walls is about a quarter of water use on standard landscapes per square meter.
Interesting.
Because it's so sophisticated, because we need to apply it directly. In terms of electricity use, the pumps are rated at something around 1 kilowatt. So they're very low rated pumps, and they're on for an average of 6 to 8 to 10 minutes a day per irrigation zone.
Right.
So, the electricity use is very, very low in terms of the input that goes in there. And again, we're monitoring that. From a financial point of view, for example, a 200 square meter living wall, the one I showed at Edgware Road tube station, it's about £6 worth of electricity per year goes into that. So that would translate to the amount of embodied energy that goes into running them. From a maintenance point of view, we are very proactive with our maintenance. We grow plants in our nursery ready to go in and to be returned, to go back into that space. The important thing is to design for access for maintenance. It really is. The easiest way to access a living wall or whatever else is the best way to do it.
Right.
Abseiling, which we do in a few cases, is the last resort.
Right.
Pretty resource heavy as well.
That's really interesting. Yeah. And then I suppose you've got a range of examples that you've shown in terms of the scale of the projects that they were part of, even Plant Box, which is sort of a small scale domestic solution. Are there any scales of projects where vertical planting wouldn't be suitable, or do you tend to think there can be a solution applied to any scale of project?
I think with good plant choice, you could apply it to any solution of project, but I would then put a word of caution to say, why would you do that? Why would you take planting out of the human realm? Like if you've got a 100-meter tower for whatever reason, why would you be putting the planting up at 100 meters where it's not going to be, the benefits aren't going to be seen, the bees don't fly that high? Why would you want to do that? There may be some design reasons to incorporate that, but I would suggest that whilst you could, why would you?
That's interesting. Yeah, so that the best spaces for it are where the benefit is that biophilia of human interaction with those planting systems.
I think so, yes. I mean, one of the things we want to do with green infrastructure as more people come into cities, by 2050, 70% of people will be living in cities, is to give that reconnection with nature. And that will then engender this sense of environmental stewardship as well, because it's really important we stay connected with nature.
And so in the case study that you mentioned, you highlighted the structural impact potential, and that I think you described that certain substructures, may not be suitable for the panels, but you came up with the solution for the concrete loading on the slab for the balconies, driving it back into the concrete substructures. Again, do you tend to recommend for particular substrates that there are different solutions available? How do you begin to approach that?
Yeah, absolutely. If it's an existing building, we need to do a structural evaluation of that building. If we're going to change the facade, whether outside or inside, we need to understand what that existing material is. So a structural evaluation will look at that and recommend the best way of fixing. We've worked with a number of situations with new build, much simpler, because we can design the range screen cladding in as a replacement material for whatever else we were going to put in.
Yes.
So rather than being an additional cost, it's a replacement cost for whatever was going to be the range screen cladding, whether that's brick or some other aluminium cladding material. You can design in the cavity spaces with insulation in there as well. So it's that full sort of thermal envelope. I'm just thinking of the green wall as another building element block, not just something you add on the outside as a nice to have.
Definitely. You mentioned a bit about your background and how you kind of got involved in this. What inspired you? What was it that brought you to the world of Biotecture and into wanting to make green infrastructure?
Yes, that's going back a bit now. So I did start in construction as a civil engineer, and I did get more and more concerned about the way that construction was missing the environmental credentials that it needed to have, and even the social credentials. The number of women in construction at the time was dreadful. Construction was very litigious as well. This is back in the late 90s. And so I started my own sustainable construction company, and that was locally to me in West Sussex here. And then realized that people weren't getting sustainability just then. They just didn't really want to know. So it was very localized. And I met a landscape designer who was given a commission to look at the potential for greening the campus of London School of Economics in the Strand. Okay. Recognized they had very few horizontal spaces, but lots of vertical. Knew I worked in construction, said, how do I fix plants to buildings? And I thought, aha, this is an opportunity to really bring nature back into our cities, to make a difference from a sustainability on a large scale. So it's really for us about understanding where construction matches with biology.
That's fantastic. And I suppose finally, what are the resources that you would recommend? So are there places that people should go to find out more information about something like biodiversity? You mentioned a couple of reports that you've read. What are the best places for somebody who's wanting to find out more about regenerative planting, biodiversity? Where should they start?
We've got a whole bunch of stuff on our website. I would say that, and some of it is geared towards, the power of plants and what they can do for us. The Stockholm Resilience Centre that I mentioned, some background on where the state of the world truly is in terms of the state of the planet truly is. The Stockholm Resilience Centre published some superb reports on the match of economy, society, and ecology, and how that moves forwards. There's a book called The Lost Words, which is for children, really, but I think it's fantastic because it talks about some of the words that have gone out of their dictionary space. So acorn has gone, whereas Apple as a computer is back in, kind of thing. And it's just really a bit weird.
Yeah, thank you so much for those answers, Richard. And I know that we'll have a number of questions from our audience as well that we'll be able to respond to further. Next, I'm going to show a demonstration of NBS Chorus and look at the Biotecture solution in NBS Source as well, and show you how we can begin to use those platforms to aim towards sustainable specification goals. Worth highlighting, I think that on the nbs.com now, we have a sustainability page. You can find that by going to the About section of the website and this new area on sustainability, indicating the work that we're doing in terms of our own targets as part of the Big Factor group. And certainly not to say that we're world leading in that respect, but we're on the right path to beginning to make the right changes to become a more sustainable business, but also how we help you to build sustainably and to find sustainable solutions and environmental properties for the products that you're specifying. So this is NBS Chorus, where you can specify using the NBS Chorus platform, and I'm in the Add Content area. And so here I'm going to search for a term that's used commonly in industry, which is green wall, and it'll find the vertical planting system. So even though that's not what they're called in Uniclass, that they have another term, vertical planting system, the synonyms and things are built into the guidance to help you use plain language to find things. And then if you look on the right hand side, you can see that there's guidance associated with each of these. So before I've added these to my job, I can look at the different guidance associated with them and see what the right system is for me. And adding these to the job is as simple as clicking on the plus button on the left hand side and then being able to add that to my job. I then get a system outline to help me to begin adding the content to specify this particular system. I've got an example here of one that's a little bit more progressed. So the system outline allows you to add some descriptive information. So it'll, at a high level, you could add the type of content that you might have from a client brief. Then system performance information, so the design, the fire performance, the durability of this system. And each one of these blue chips is a clause that allows you to then add and build the content of your specification in different ways, and each one is hyperlinked, so that'll take you to, for example, in this case, the fire performance clause for this particular system. And again, the guidance on the right hand side is contextual, so it'll sync up with wherever you are in the specification to help you find the relevant guidance to specify these systems. In terms of system manufacturers, the product information is driven directly from NBS source, so you've got the ability to add and access information from NBS source, our manufacturer platform, and there you can see, for example, the Biotecture solution, and read out more information about that, see the clause itself and all of the information that's within there, and we'll have a look in NBS source in a moment. But then you can see that there's all kinds of different structural, product and component clause items as well to help you make choices relevant to this particular system as to whether this is going to be held on timber battens, whether it needs a particular kind of membrane, and you can work with the manufacturer to begin to fill in this information. And depending on what access you have and your abilities to collaborate with other organizations within Chorus, you could even invite consultants, specialists and manufacturers to partly work on the spec with you and then revoke those permissions when you need to, but to allow them to develop the specification with you. So you can see the kind of information we can break down here from the different installations, membranes, the panels that are going to be used, and then into accessories and things as well. But then at the base of every system outline clause, we then have a great deal of execution, workmanship type clauses about installing the various categories of things that we've specified, the surveys and pre-installation work that might need to be done, and anything like mock-ups and prototypes can be specified here as well. And then in terms of system completion, what are the ways that this is going to be verified that it is meeting the performance that's required? What about operations and maintenance and handover checks? The kind of content that's now so critical to the golden thread of information. And then how is this system going to be maintained and irrigated in terms of how this system is kept looking as good as it is on day one, months and years into the future for that particular system. So again, clauses to allow you to specify all of that information, and you can add in placeholders for each of these if there's something that you need to consider in the future, but again, work with a manufacturer on. You can add in just a placeholder chip at this stage. That won't print as part of your specification when you publish it, whereas the ones that are blue will print and publish as part of your outputs, which allows you that control over how the specification is developing and to keep it really concise and clear in terms of the requirements that you're wanting to put together. So now in NBS Source, our manufacturer product information platform, I wanted to show you a particular example of how more and more manufacturers are providing environmental properties in terms of the work that they do. So this is a concrete block manufacturer and a whole range of different products and concrete blocks available from them. But within the specification data, which you can jump to with this link here, there's obviously all of the kind of key criteria that you would expect to be there, whether it's thermal conductivity, its resistance, tolerance categories and sizings and all of those kind of things. But equally, we're now beginning to embed enhanced environmental properties against these manufacturers too. So where is the product manufactured? So how far is it needing to travel from its country of manufacture? It's embodied carbon, and in terms of how those are assessed, we're working with manufacturers to standardize a measurement in that way. Whether it's recyclable and how much of the content is recyclable, and how much of the content of the existing object is already recycled content. And there are a number of other credentials and certificates as well that you may see from other manufacturers. But there's this core set of environmental properties that we're beginning to see more and more manufacturers provide, and we're working with all of the manufacturers within NBS Source to help enhance that data. So let's also look at Biotecture. And again, Within NBS Source, you then have access to their website. You can contact them directly, find their social media, and an overview of their products. In this case, the living wall system that Richard has gone through. And again, that specification data of how the various properties and different parameters can be specified for this particular system and what the variants are that are available for that. So some really great information within there, and the ability to then use this as a searching and platform for being able to find the products that you're wanting to use, and then to use this permalink to then bring that into NBS Chorus if you need to. So you can copy a permalink from NBS Source and then drop that into the system manufacturer category within a clause in NBS Chorus, and that will then bring in that information. So here I am back in NBS Chorus, and I'm going to use that permalink and drop that into the system manufacturer clause item. And I'm asked if I'd like to add that product from NBS Source to that clause. I can choose to add the product, and then it'll drop in the system manufacturer, their contact details for inquiries and making contact, but also that product reference for the specific product that you've chosen. And then here are a set of parameters and properties specific to that system to help you make the choice of what requirements might be as part of that system. And that would be true for any kind of product that's been dropped into NBS Chorus. The manufacturers work with us to develop a set of criteria or parameters that need to be filled in to help specify that particular system. The last thing that I wanted to make you aware of is that back in 2012, NBS ran a sustainability survey, and we're currently in the same process now. So if you're interested in sharing your views on sustainability, what it means to you personally, and what it means to you as an organisation, then take our survey. You can follow the links through via Twitter or LinkedIn and our social media. And if you complete that survey, you'll gain early access to the report that's generated as well. And for every response that we get, up to 1,000 responses, I think, we're planting another tree as part of the forest carbon work. So do get involved in that process. In terms of next steps, Biotecture have provided a list of further reading resources and links, which if it's not already attached as part of today's session, we'll follow up with that in an email so that you can access some of those great resources that Richard has shown in his presentation. We'd love you to use NBS Chorus and NBS Source to be specifying more sustainably, to be sharing your product information through NBS Source if you're a manufacturer, or to be specifying systems like vertical planting within your projects. And one of our team will be in touch with all attendees from today. But if you have any queries that haven't been covered today, or you'd like to get in touch sooner, please just make contact using the information at the bottom of this slide. Thanks so much to Richard for presenting. Thanks to you for attending and listening. And I look forward to seeing you at the next webinar with my colleague Lee. And then the fourth webinar I'm presenting with Claire from Everflow about the sustainable water cycle. See you then.